Hello. I want to tell you about the day when Frank walked into my room. Little did I know he was planning on quitting. When Frank sat down, I asked him what he was up to. In turn, he asked me if I knew anything about biology. And I said, well, not very much, Frank. I was initially trained in physics. He seemed to roll his eyes a bit as if to say, wow, this is probably going to be a waste of time. He then asked me if I knew that proteins were extremely large molecules. I said I thought they were, but I really didn't know why. Again, I could see a little disappointment in Frank's eyes. He explained that there was a special place on proteins called the binding site. The binding site is where the protein does its work. All those atoms in the protein provide the scaffolding so that the binding site can be extremely specific in its interactions with other proteins and enzymes. If it were not specific, the proteins in our bodies would inappropriately interact with each other and our bodies wouldn't function. Proteins are like biological supercomputers that do one thing extremely well. Frank explained to me that he could predict the properties of a protein's binding site using a computer. After telling me this, he asked whether I got it or not. Got it? Again, I had to say that I really didn't quite get it, and I could see more disappointment. He said, well, assuming you have a health problem related to a specific protein, once you can predict the binding site, you can then design a new drug to modify the protein's behavior. Frank was saying that he could design new drugs in a computer. He explained that no one had ever been able to do this before, but he had a new approach that he was sure would work. This was potentially a hugely valuable idea. He tried to describe it to me, but like many brilliant people, I really couldn't figure it out. Well, Frank passed my first test, though. This was certainly an important customer and market need, but it was not at all obvious that Frank's ideas would work. That would take some effort to prove. Later, I found out why Frank was thinking of quitting. Frank's description of what he was doing was completely opaque and frankly, seemingly impossible. How many times have we all run into this? His presentation was about his idea, or as we say at SRI, it was a big A presentation. It was all about his approach. Listening to him made you feel like you were an English major reading a book on quantum mechanics. When Frank came into my room, I was the second-ranking person in SRI's subsidiary company, the Sarnoff Corporation. He had tried everyone else, and he felt he had to at least see me before he walked out the door. After listening to Frank for over an hour, I asked him what he wanted. He said his goal was to have a research program for a few $100,000 a year. I suggested that we might be able to do better than that. He then asked me what I wanted him to do. I could tell he was feeling impatient, so I looked at my watch and said, Frank, I'll be free at 7 tonight. Why don't you come back with 4 view graphs that define your value proposition, one each for your important need, your approach to addressing that need, the benefits per cost of your approach, and why these benefits per cost are superior to the competing and alternative approaches. I explained that these 4 questions were fundamental to all business opportunities, and it didn't take much sense to do more research until we could answer them. Frank quietly nodded his head, yes, and later I learned that he expected me to ask him to write up a several hundred-page report before coming back to see me. If I had done that, he would have known I was not serious and I was just putting him off. And if I had done that, he was going to walk out the door. But because I only asked Frank for 4 reasonable view graphs, he felt he had to give them a try. As Frank was about to get up, I asked him if he would be the champion for the project. He asked me what that meant. I listed our catechism. He would learn the necessary value creation skills. He would work productively with others. He would continuously iterate his value proposition, encouraging new input from all. He would take the best interests of our partners and SRI into account. He would persevere no matter what, and he would succeed. Just that. He looked a little uncertain. He then asked what the probability of success would be if he did all these things, and I said, in my experience, close to 100%. But we might end up in a very different place from what he was thinking about today. He said he wasn't sure, so I said, fine, Frank, but in 2 weeks, I will ask you again, and if you say no to being our champion, we'll have to stop. I explained that we had learned the hard way that without a committed champion, there was no chance of success. He said, all right, went off. And when he came back that night, his value proposition was not very good. In truth, they never are. Indeed, it was indecipherable. As always, the customer need was obvious. There was no competition, even though we were going up against the multi-hundred-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry. We had another discussion, and I asked Frank to talk to some of our folks who might help and then come back the next day with another iteration of his value proposition. He came back day after day for short meetings, and I would ask more questions and then send him off to talk to additional folks. We iterated his value proposition dozens and dozens of times. After a bit, we found another great colleague, John, and now we had the beginnings of a real multidisciplinary team. 2 folks who actually knew something about the technology and the market, and me. What I added was knowledge about value creation and how to efficiently get the answers we needed. We eventually put in place all our other value creation processes and met with many potential partners and customers. 18 months later, we had formed a new company called Locust Discovery. Frank had a multi-million-dollar research program. He had founders' stock in the new company, and he was working with some of the best people in the world. Oh, by the way, I never had to ask Frank again whether he was the champion. He was. And truth be known, I could tell he was the moment he came through the door. It was easy to see his passion. His performance was truly outstanding. Locust Discovery now has 3 drugs through phase 1. The company still has a long way to go. But if we get even 1 drug through phase 3, we'll have a very important company on our hands. And if Frank had walked out the door that day, those potential hundreds of millions of dollars of value would have invisibly walked out with him. When I see Frank these days, he always gives me a hug, which is fun since I'm 6'2" and Frank is built more like a fire hydrant. But Frank and I have a very special relationship because I was his coach who helped him see his dream come true. And now Frank has those rare value creation skills, which means he can do it over and over. How many Franks walk out of companies every year because their seemingly crazy ideas cannot be understood, improved, and turned into a valuable innovation? Right. Lots. For example, Steve Wozniak walked out of HP. He loved HP, but he couldn't get anyone to listen to him after repeated tries. At HP, they had no process for capturing the genius of their Wozniaks. Fortunately, after he left, he found a partner named Steve Jobs, and his dream came true too. The goal of all enterprises is to create major business opportunities. Toward that goal, one of the most rewarding things you can do is to help the Franks and Wozniaks in your enterprise be successful. My many positive experiences, like the one with Frank, are a reason why I'm so committed to innovation best practices. Practices that capture the passion, vision, and genius of our teams. Thank you.